Okay, thanks everyone for joining today and welcome to our webinar. Today's topic is how to automate your quality assurance and data validation for IBM Campaign and Interact. And I'm Brad Penwarden. I've worked with some of you before, so thanks for joining. And to anyone new, nice to meet you. I'm a Unica architect and a product manager here at Client Spectrum with our campaignQA tool and other custom developments. But today is really about, again, quality assurance and data validation for IBM Campaign and Interact. Talking about who I am, to those who don't know me, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges we've seen with QA processes, in particular with IBM Campaign and Interact. We'll talk about the growing importance of marketing quality assurance, specifically about the marketing automation space and how it can impact businesses. I'll introduce and do a short demo of Client Spectrum's campaignQA tool, showing you how it can integrate with the IBM Campaign and Interact tools and how it can help you address some of these challenges. And if you have any questions today, please put them into the chat window in the WebEx, and we'll address those at the end. And we'll also be doing a follow-up after this call to see if you have any questions or address anything specifically that you may have. Okay. So who am I? So again, my name is Brad Penwarden. I'm a product development manager now at Client Spectrum. I've been working with 30+ Unica engagements and 8 years of experience in a variety of roles across North America and Europe. I've had an opportunity to wear a number of hats. I've been a solutions consultant, working directly with Unica teams and really working with the day-to-day problems of Unica environments, including list automation, solutions design and build, and again, trying to address some of those quality assurance problems that a lot of our clients have. I've been a systems architect as well, both installing, migrating, and designing larger solutions that leverage the IBM suite and integrate within the larger enterprise architecture of your companies. And I've also had a chance to do a fair bit of custom development as well as a software developer, using IBM EMM specific software tools like the APIs, using tools that are hidden under the surface, and also building custom solutions to meet needs like Client Spectrum Companion and as well our tool here, campaignQA. So we're going to touch on some of the common challenges of QA with Interact and Campaign in mind, and some of the things that we've noticed in commonalities across a lot of clients. And we're going to start at a high level here and talk about 3 sort of common challenges, and I'll drill down to them in a bit more detail and how they relate to your lives. One is just the concept of the abstractions that IBM Campaign performs. And I say here the devil is in the details, but it's very true for a tool like this. It's a productivity suite. It's designed to make your life and your SQL a little bit easier to write and kind of hide some of that knowledge you need to write these marketing automation lists. But in doing so, it can make some challenges and bring up interesting problems that really necessitate QA. We'll also talk about the changing business landscape and pressures we're seeing in a lot of teams to go towards what people might call event-driven campaigns, or really on-demand campaigns, and this requires an on-demand QA approach that, can run many times a day, intraday, once a day, a variable amount. We'll also talk about inbound marketing and the challenges that it presents and its new way of thinking with its world of sort of always on, 24/7, whether you're in the office or not, and just the sheer amount of volume it generates. Even in very simple cases, hundreds of thousands of calls an hour is not uncommon. So it's really important to think about QA in a very different context for this world. So one thing I'd like to touch on first for the abstraction piece is just the concept of table mappings. I think probably a lot of us are familiar with the concept of a table mapping in IBM Campaign. It's a way for me to reference a table, a set of columns in some object somewhere in a database or a file, and leverage that. And in the process, it asks me a number of smaller questions. Is this audience level normalized? Or if I'm mapping like a dimension table, it may also ask questions about how I want to join. These are pretty small options. They don't seem to indicate much. They probably have minimal impact, but in reality, these actually define how this tool is performing QA and SQL, I should say, on the back end. And it can have actually cascading effects on how your data is generated. For example, with an output list, say we're thinking about something like an email address. And perhaps in our data model, Brad can have 0 to many email addresses registered with our system. Depending upon how this table join method is configured, I could generate a row where if Brad does not have an email, he's not present in the output, which may or may not be correct. I could generate a row where Brad shows up, whether or not he has an email. Perhaps his email address shows up as a blank or a null. That may or may not be correct. Or also, if there's many email addresses under my name, I could get multiple rows in the output indicating each of my email addresses. And these may seem small, but this really does impact your list, the perception, the number of count, and contacts generated. So it's important to consider these things when generating your lists, and small decisions can cascade into larger list generation issues. And then sort of staying in the concept of a template library, perhaps, and to table mappings, perhaps you've created those table mappings in your flowchart and you have a set that you're comfortable with and that are operating well. And IBM Campaign gives you a reusability concept called the template library, which sort of allows me to set up a number of pre-configured process boxes for reusability. Great idea, improves my life, simplifies my work, makes total sense, and I recommend a lot of people use these. But one of the things IBM Campaign doesn't really explain to you is that when you use these template libraries, what comes with it is a set of assumed table mappings. It brings its own idea of how data should exist or what tables are important into your flowchart. And if there's a conflict, it can override them with its own impression, causing more issues and again, more risk. And so it's important to think about what you're doing and understanding how these things work at a lower level. And if you're not aware of this, it can bring quite a bit of risk into your list generation. And then there's also the concept of just the SQL assumptions at its core level. Again, the very nature of IBM Campaign is that the processing analysis, some of that is configured in these settings. And hitting here in the configuration tab, there's a section about data processing. And these don't really seem like many options. Not a lot of people pay attention to these. But these actually define how the tool operates at its very low SQL level. For example, string concat with nulls is nulls. What does that mean? What this tells the campaign tool is that if I'm adding together a couple of strings, like first name and last name, for example, how should it operate? So if I add Brad with a blank string, a null string, should it become nothing, or should it just be Brad plus no values? If you have this as true, that means Brad becomes nothing. That may or may not be what you want, but if you're not paying attention to this, this can impact the quality and the lists you generate. Another core assumption of the tool, and the counts you see therein, is that everything is distinct in that every ID is unique, which again may or may not be correct. And it doesn't really appear as a problem during your list creation inside the flowchart, but it manifests itself once you actually output the list to another system like a table or file. And you can see here, for example, perhaps I have a list of 7,078 names, but until I get to one of these snapshot or mail list files, I won't know that I have a duplicate until I try to extract that, at which point it will appear, and then the problems start to rise again, back to that whole 0 rows on match or many rows on match or even null values. And just again brings back those core quality concepts that you need to think about. There's also the business pressure we're seeing a lot to focus marketing automation on automation. There's more and more emphasis we're seeing on our business partners, running series of flowcharts without human intervention and delivering lists to external vendors for things like email, SMS, other kinds of new integrations, things like DMP. And this is supposed to be automated, and it would run once a day, many times a day, intraday, really being called to from another system as a service rather than the traditional, we're going to run this every Tuesday, send the list, and see what happens. This is just sort of what's happening in a lot of our clients, and the old QA processes of spot checks, inspection as we generate these lists are very hard to sustain and sometimes just unsustainable as the volume grows. So clients are struggling more and more to come up with ways to apply adaptive data loading and come up with complex variable rules that can really integrate with your QA process and your list process. So a new way of thinking is needed and a new way of applying this QA is required to meet these needs. And then there's just the whole concept of, inbound marketing. And this is, again, a very logical shift in how marketing is performed. No more is it I generate a list and I contact people. Now it's about people coming into me, some unknown number of people, often many at the same moment in time. And they come into our endpoints, like our mobile application, or our call center, or our website. And what this does is gives tools like Interact a way to reach out, sometimes using even very specific data from the website, things like what's in my search bar. I come up with a complicated segmentation logic, which sometimes, again, with that input from the channel can vary and is hard to test. And then from there, we go down even to this offer arbitration logic, which is often, dynamic scores driven by, again, context-specific information like what was I searching for, what page I'm on. So all of this complicates into, conflicting offers, difficult to test scenarios, and it operates in milliseconds. You have 100 milliseconds to send this message back and display it to the user to not interrupt their experience. Traditional ways of QA can't work here. You can't intercept the message and review it. It happens too fast, it happens too constantly. A new way of thinking is required. So why is QA important? So there's business impacts. There's effects on the customer perception. Marketing is very much a communication of trust. People listen to me in my marketing emails because they believe I have some message and something valuable to share with them. It's a dialogue. It's really customer-centric where we're trying to share value and find something that works for both of us. But if I'm sending people too many emails, confusing emails, conflicting emails, that trust and that reputation gets eroded. They start to not listen to me because they don't either think I know what I'm doing or that I don't care about them or, I don't value that communication and that conversation. And eventually, if that reputation degrades enough, I'll put you into the spam folder or worse and start blocking you. And once someone blocks you, it's very, very difficult to get them back. They're basically untouchable. And, if you can't contact them, it's very hard to derive value from them. There's also financial impacts. A lot of countries are now putting legislation in place to do fines for issues related to do not call lists, do not email, etc. Canada, the US, and even the European Union now have actual legislation that is a financial amount per infraction for things like do not call, do not email, or even messaging people too many times. And there's also the, internal costs. One, the ROI on delivering your message. For example, say I abandon a shopping cart on a website. The sooner the website can reach back to me and your marketing can reach out to me and let me know that, hey, you abandoned a shopping cart and here's some percentage off, the more likely I would be to accept. But if there's a long delay because a QA process needs to be performed, the longer we have to wait, the less likely I am to receive, impacting the ROI and hurting the effectiveness of your marketing. And then there's also the cost in terms of time of your team. The teams we work with usually have to do more work with less time, less money, and QA processes are very, very time consuming. It's a very manual effort these days. You have to load the data, determine what rules to run, execute the rules, make an analysis. Time is money, and there's not a lot of time going around for these teams. You're being pressured to do more with less. And carrying on with that same, impacts on your team, it's just getting more complex to manage a QA process. You've got more systems like inbound marketing, outbound marketing systems, SMS tools. You have digital media platforms where you're buying ad space in the broader market. You're getting more and different kinds of data and sources. You're getting things like IVR data, the call logs are stored. You perform natural language processing to determine, was this person happy when they called the call center? You're getting weblog data that kind of scrapes what people were doing on the website, pages they visited, what they did on the page. These are new kinds of data, and they bring new sources of error, weird things that you hadn't thought about and didn't really fit into the traditional data model of the past. And again, this is more stress on your team to perform more QA faster while still keeping up the traditional operations. So what is campaignQA? So Client Spectrum developed a tool called campaignQA to help our clients with the QA challenges you see before. It validates data against user-defined rules. After the user-defined rules are performed, it corrects the input list based on the rules provided. And then we also generate reports on the QA results to allow teams to perform investigation, analysis, and determine, what happened and what was the cause of the error and how to proceed. So how does campaignQA execute within an outbound context? So typically when you execute your campaign, we can use what's called a trigger to reach into our system and cause our application to go ahead and load the data set automatically, so dynamically pick up your data, import it to our system, run a set of user-driven rules against it to ask important questions and make decisions. We generate a wealth of audit data that represents, here's the data we saw, here's what came out of it, here's the rules, so that you can report on it with other systems like Tableau, Cognos, or any other tool. We also generate user reports that help aggregate and highlight problems, performance statistics. And then finally, we also help generate action in that we generate cleaned lists. We remove those violating rows so that you can integrate this with downstream processes. So if you're running in a very event-driven context, we could take out those people who look like they have a problem, set them aside for your team to analyze, but also create a very valid list that you could share with this downstream process and deliver something of value. What about the inbound context? So again, as we talked about, there's a lot of data being generated, millisecond response time. It's difficult to intercept the rules, so it's a different way of thinking. We need to adaptively load your data, asking questions of it over a period of time, continuously. It's a monitoring problem. You need to look at your contacts, ask questions of it like, has someone seen this offer more than 4 times in the last day? We probably need to adjust our rules to make sure that people don't get the same offer too many times, that we try new offers. Are people not getting responses back? Are we not seeing rejects or accepts or even clicks on our offer? Perhaps that means there's a problem with our channel and that they're not integrating properly with our tool to inform us of what's happening with that offer. And also checking things like your input data. Is my profile table correct? Am I using the whitelist and blacklist correctly to generate this targeting? And all this is with the goal of, reviewing what you're doing with Interact, adjusting those complex strategies and sessions to adjust and re-implement and redeploy to make sure that you're doing the best job you can. And with the sheer volume that a tool like this generates while it's running all day, every day, a small mistake can quickly scale into a big problem. And tools like this are meant to, report, monitor, and keep on top of that problem. So now we're going to jump into a demonstration. And there's 2 key things I wanted to show here is, 1, how you could use campaignQA with an outbound flowchart. And then 2 is just to show how it could exist with an inbound flowchart. So we'll talk about automating a QA process from campaignQA. So I'm going to step out of the PowerPoint here, and we're just going to show a simple flowchart. So I've got a simple flowchart here, but the concepts I think are pretty widespread. So the idea here is I have a list and I have a flowchart and it generates a list and it exports to a table I call the video list. Okay? And it has some trigger assigned to it. Okay, there's a trigger called campaignQA. So using our open architecture, we can reach into campaignQA and ask it to perform some work. Okay, so now it's linked to the flowchart. If I go into something like campaignQA now, we have a concept called the data set, which is basically a reference to the data that you're going to be generating. It's dynamically loaded at execution time. So in this case, we have video list. Yep, that's the one I generated. I let it know where it lives. If it's a table or a file, I give it a user-friendly name, where it actually lives, and then I define that table, what the columns are, what the types. Great, so I have a reference to this table. I go ahead and create some rules against the table. So we'll look for my video list. There it is. And I've created a very simple set of rules, but you could do something more complex and ask more detailed questions. And in this case, I have two checks. One, that people have not opted out of all marketing, and then another check to make sure that they are emailable. So if anyone is not emailable but has not opted out of all marketing, they're good. So simple question. And now we go back to our flowchart, and we can see here, so I asked this question, I ran the list earlier this morning, and I see that it exported 7,078 rows. So I can go ahead and look at a report and do some data analysis. Let's see what happened with that list. So I select my data set that I want to review. I select the rules that I want to check against it, and I see, okay, it ran earlier today at 10:40 a.m. So I can actually click to drill down into that row. I can see when it started, how long the job took, how many rows we processed, how many rules we ran against it, and an idea of how many problems occurred. And oh, look, I've got 735 people who failed my email rule. So we can go ahead and click on that. And from here, we can drill down into the specifics, and I see, oh yeah, I've got 74 pages of people who had this problem. Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, it looks like my rule was correct. It did what I wanted. But I want to ask, I want to analyze this or share this with another user. I can go ahead and download the results directly to my computer. And now I have a CSV that represents those failures so that I can do some other layer of analysis, perhaps off the system. Okay, so this is great. It identified I had a problem, so I need to correct. And in this case, perhaps I just simply forgot to apply an opt-out. So I'll go ahead and apply the opt-out to my merge file. I'll make sure that I exclude these people. I'm going to save and run this branch. Okay, so my mail list is running. I merged and excluded those people, so you see my count has dropped. Okay, and it completed. So again, if we go back through the process, again, I didn't have to recreate my data set. My data set already existed. It's just a logical reference to some file. My rule set exists already, so I don't need to redefine any rules. If I wanted to add new rules, I could have added them, and I can add them at any time. I go ahead and check back to the reports. I can go look at the video list. I can look at the rules I ran against it. And I see there was another run, and this was just over a minute ago. It ran in 6 seconds. It processed 6,343 rows. And oh, look, everything looks great. Fantastic. So you can see that I've connected my flowchart to campaignQA through the use of that trigger. And it's very easy to integrate and get meaningful inputs in an automated way. So just to walk through that process again. Step 1 is we make a reference to our data that we'd like to process. We define some set of rules we'd like to run against our data in an ongoing fashion. We run a flowchart where we use the trigger concept to link into campaignQA. We can review the results either within the tool, via some other custom reporting tool like Tableau, or even getting emails from campaignQA that indicate here's your success or failure. Oh, we realized that there was a problem in the preceding flowchart. We forgot to apply an opt-out, so we modify the flowchart, apply the opt-out, run it again. And sure enough, we saw that everything looked okay. Fantastic. But also there's the deeper data analysis we performed with our tool, where we could actually drill down to a specific run, see the problems associated with it and the rows associated. Get an idea of just, was our count what we wanted it to be? How long did it take to process? And oh, look, we can even see, there's a problem with a rule in particular. We can select that rule and view the details of that rule's error, and even download the results to a CSV file that we can use for Excel-based reporting, etc. Okay, so that's how you can integrate campaignQA with a outbound campaign, even in an event-driven automated fashion. But what about an inbound campaign? So again, we talked about how this is, more of a monitoring problem, right? The goal here is to try and keep track of your data, see what's happening both on the inbound and output to your Interact tool, and then adjust your targeting and segmentation as needed. So let's go back into campaignQA here. And so I've created, for example, a data set that represents our profile table. So we have a sample Interact profile table. We define where it lives, the type of data. And again, we have a number of columns that represent what this data is. In this case, it's a profile table. But as we said earlier, it could also represent your contact history table, your response history table. It could represent your whitelisting and your blacklisting tables. Really any of the data that Interact's using to consume and generate offers, as well as the outputs it generates. And your goal here is proactive monitoring to try and stay on top of those problems that can occur. Okay, so we've got a reference to our data, and now we'll go ahead and make a rule set against it, a set of questions to ask it. And I have one here called profile table confirmation. And I've got a number of rules in it, including asking questions like, there can only be one segment per individual. This is single offline customer segment. And perform a group by and count how many instances there are, and it should be less than or equal to 1. Okay, that makes sense. Or I can ask simple questions like the format, opt-out marketing is null or blank. That makes sense. Or I can even check the value of individual contacts, that opt-out marketing equals 0 is acceptable as well. But I can also add different rules of different varieties. For example, we create a simple duplicate check that says, make sure this column does not exist more than n times in the file. Make sure certain values of fields are not empty. For example, things like if you're generating an email address cannot be null or blank. We can also do something more robust where we can compare the data in the data set we've loaded against some other set of data. For example, we could compare a file that we loaded from your flowchart against a file generated by another flowchart and do a cross-reference. We could load a table and compare against a file, or a table against a table. You could check things against contact history or treatments. So really just comparing two sets of data against each other. We can do statistical checks, asking for things like the count or the average, the min, the max, and really make some judgments about how this relates in the wider scheme of the table. We can check the structure to make sure that it's not null or blank. That a first name, last name combination is less than 7 characters. We can check the value in a field to make sure that it's a valid value, things like checking the format, if it's a proper email address. And we can also template out and build new rules as required. Again, all of this is a templating logic. We could generate new custom rules that ask questions and simplify the process of thinking, but provide a very simple interface to ask that question. But for now, I'll add a new exists rule, for example, just to show you how that might work. So if I select exists, I can create a new rule like whitelist interact eligible. I can specify a column from the table, my individual ID. I can select a table I'd like to compare against, for example, the yearly holdout. And I can even specify a field that joins on. So this confirms that this individual ID, for example, exists in this other table in the customer ID. This can be used again to do whitelisting concepts, blacklisting concepts. This can also be piggybacked to perform a little more complex comparisons like, does this person exist in this other table and have a value that is equivalent? For example, if I had a master table that showed, a person's current mortgage rate that we've offered, for example, we could use this to say, make sure the person is 1, mortgage eligible in this table, and 2, also has a value that equals a value in the list I've generated. I don't want people to get offers with different mortgage rates when I've established what it should be, for example. So I've created that rule. And then again, we go back to the scheduling concept. And so because Interact is an ongoing 24/7, the whole on-demand nature and calling out to IBM, calling out to campaignQA from IBM Interact is not really as feasible. The goal here is to monitor and adjust and make sure that we're doing the correct thing. So we could create a schedule to say, you know what, I'd like to do a schedule called Interact Profile Test. I'd like to load this set of rules, connect to this data set. I'd like to start on some day at some time, potentially never end. In this case, I'm saying just please always run every day at 1 p.m. and then give me a report that I can look at and make an assessment on. And the frequency is customizable. You could go hourly or daily, weekly, monthly, or just a one-off if you just want to do some sort of ad hoc testing. Okay, so I pick that. And now I can go back to my reports. I can go to my sample Interact profile data. I can select my rule set. And you can see here the runs over time, and it's running pretty much every day at 1 p.m. I can drill into a specific result. I can see that it loaded 55,000 rows. It ran 3 rules, and there were no problems. So this concept of monitoring and staying on top of your Interact data to make sure that errors aren't creeping in. And it can be adjusted over time, adding new rules to make sure that you're aware of what's going on and monitoring your system. So again, the 1, 2, 3, we load a data set that references some inbound or outbound data. We generate some rules to run against it. We created a schedule to specify how often to run and ask questions of this data, and if it should end at any point in time at all. And we go ahead and generate reports that, again, can be emailed or shared with the team in some fashion to really get an idea of what's going on with your data and adjust your targeting and segmentation if needed. Okay, so that's it for me. I'd like to thank you for your time. You know, I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to listen to what I have to say, to hear about some of the common problems, and hopefully this is valuable for you. And again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to email them to us at marketing@clientspectrum.com. We will also be providing a follow-up email just to connect with you to see if you have any questions and make sure that we answered your questions in the webinar.